107 Talk, bringing the world to your radio station. Well, this is a Sunday afternoon. That is also bonfire afternoon, just before the actual bonfire night that many other nations don't quite understand the reason why we actually seem to celebrate, putting that in sort of inverted commas, if you like, bonfire night, in addition to Halloween that's taken off here. And you're going to talk about Guy Fawkes himself, which is what it all evolves around. And you know what? He's the one that an effigy is made of and placed on top of a lot of bonfires that we have to about 100 feet behind it or something, or probably a lot further than that with health and safety. But don't think they would have treated Guy Fawkes quite the same if he was real. Your idea is that Guy Fawkes might not have actually been real himself, or might not have existed at all. Is that what I'm to take from what you're thinking?
Well, yeah, he either existed, but not in the way that we know him, or is a figment of someone's imagination. Now, I'll just say from the outset, it's not just a theory. I think, well, I'm hoping your listeners will find it of interest. At the very least, what we'd like to do is convince you that the story, at least, of Bonfire Night and Guy Fawkes isn't quite as we know it. And I suspect, whether or not, this is a case of government fake news or a lot of coincidence, I'm just convinced that there's maybe something else about the story of Guy Fawkes that we should just have a look at.
So we're going back to 1605, when there was only really one official source of news at the time, really, because the press, I presume, that was controlled. So the story it can be looked at either from the point of view of the establishment, that it's celebrated that a plot to ruin the establishment, which was at the time the government, the parliamentary government. I guess some people were quite happy that there was parliamentary democracy against monarchy, in addition to, at least by then, although there was obviously the English Civil War to follow to settle that score. But then I've come across others who have said that it's a celebration of the attempt to bring down the establishment of Parliament. So before we even get into whether it's whether the whole thing is just a myth like King Arthur, which side do you think it's definitely on?
I think it's definitely on the side of, there was undoubtedly a plot of some ilk, but I think what the government of the time has done is embellish it, make this beast grow more legs and tails and heads than it actually had, for its own benefit. I think it'd be useful. I mean, in this day of terror ourselves, I think we can certainly look at the issue of the gunpowder plot in a similar light. I think it'd be useful, really, to put things into a bit of context first. So we're dealing with in 1603, Elizabeth the First of England passes away, and her cousin James VI of Scotland becomes King of England, Wales, and already being King of Scotland. He is seen pretty much as an outsider in England. He's a Scot who's come onto the English throne, very much an outsider. But there is a bit of relief in some of the Catholic realms that this king, who's married to a Catholic, I think it was a Danish princess, she was an open Catholic. There is this sort of belief at the time that the persecutions of the previous century would potentially come to a bit of an end. And certainly for the first year of his reign, there isn't as many persecutions. The so-called reticent charges, these are fines that are levied per week on families that refuse to turn up to Protestant services essentially a tax on being a Catholic. They're not really levied, and it's only when we get to 1604 that things begin to change. A bit about James VI. He was an incredibly superstitious person. He was brought up Protestant. His mother, Mary Queen of Scots, Catholic. He was brought up in by council in Scotland, who brought him up in the Protestant faith. He is very interested in the occult. He's very interested in witchcraft. He writes books about how to deal with witches and how to find them. So he's a very superstitious person himself, but he's inherited a lot of Elizabeth I's baggage, if you will. So he joins, he comes onto the English crown, finding that the war with Spain, which most people know about, the Spanish Armada and all of this, the war with Spain is still raging. The Privy Council, so the likes of Robert Cecil, who was Elizabeth's spy master, and his father before them, are on the Privy Council of England. So nothing really has changed in terms of the governmental layout, but certainly the outlook has. So by 1604, when you have the reintroduction of reticence, fines, etc., this really upsets the Catholic population at the time. Now, the impression we get is that the Catholics are plotting all over the show, and that really isn't the case. Most are just getting on with their daily business, but there is undoubtedly a small proportion of people in the country who were wanting rid of yet another Protestant monarch. So some of the key conspirators in the Gunpowder plot, the likes of Robert Catesby, for example, he absolutely existed. And he really is the ringleader of the Gunpowder plot. So if we want to look at some of our first sort of myth busting, if we will, most people will assume that Guy Fawkes was indeed the head of the plot, and he wasn't. It was a relatively wealthy Catholic landholder by the name of Robert Catesby, who from the 24th of March 1603 thereafter up to 1604 had been hatching plots to assassinate the king with the assistance of Philip III of Spain. So Catesby had a rebellious streak in him, is what I'm saying. He'd been involved in Essex's rebellion, Robert de Vaux, in 1601 to potentially kill Queen Elizabeth, but at least to get rid of some of the so-called corrupt officials around Elizabeth, including Cecil, who's a very interesting character. He's been caught in acts of rebellion, but has, through, charm and luck maybe, hasn't been sent to the Tower. He's sort of been let go. As I said, 1604, things begin to change. So in late February 1604, two things happen that begin to change James's outlook on Catholics within England. The first being that the Pope had sent a rosary to his wife, Queen Anne. And then a few days after this, on the 22nd of February 1604, James orders that all Catholic priests and any Jesuits should leave the country immediately. He also gives a speech then in early March saying that essentially the previous acts that were passed by Elizabeth would be reinforced, and that He desired peace with Spain, but if possible, peace within the country as well. The country is incredibly fractious at this point, and again, he's quite unpopular, really. He's a foreigner telling English people what to do. That's certainly those petty arguments haven't left us even to today. So you've got a lot of plotting then with Catholics in the country and the Kingdom of Spain. So I should explain just how close Spain was. It wasn't, just where we know Spain is today on the map. Spain had a far-flung empire from South America all the way up to the Netherlands. In fact, for a good while, the Netherlands wasn't an independent country. It was known as the Spanish and then later the Austrian Netherlands. So the border with Spain isn't that far away. It's quite literally over the channel. And this means that Spain can begin to intervene in any plots that suits its diplomatic purpose, if you will. So it's undoubtedly in that context, there's no argument here that Catesby, Thomas Percy, Tom Winter, John Light were holding meetings to discuss ways of getting rid of the king. But this person, in terms of Guy Fawkes, who was using the name John Johnson, begins to just ring a few bells. So with Guy Fawkes, you've got firstly this idea of a pseudonym. So before we get into the meat of this, we should just maybe break down the name Guy Fawkes. So the term Guy, which we're all familiar with, burning of the guy and all of that. Actually, the etymology behind it means someone of eccentric appearance or someone who would give you a fright. The surname Fawkes, where you get the surnames Fox and Faulkner and all the rest of it from, you've sort of got a bit of when you put the two names together, you've kind of got this idea of a Faulkner, someone who owns a bird that can be everywhere, in the sky and can see all. And then you've got the first name in someone who gives you a fright. In other words, you sort of get the impression already of a sort of national conspiracy. You get this idea of, the Reds under the bed. Apart from this was the Catholics under the bed, and in some cases quite literally, if we look at priestholds, etc., etc. So, if we just look at the traditional timeline, we've got in 1604, late 1604, Parliament's adjourned in the October time. You've got meetings of the main conspirators who are desperately seeking funds, purchasing gunpowder, which there's a bit more interest in the gunpowder as we move on through this tale, and that they were wanting to strike as early as possible, but unfortunately, an outbreak of plague in the December of 1604 meant that Parliament wouldn't reopen until the 3rd of October in 1605, which suited the plotters quite well, actually, because as it happens, as we're moving to 1605, in late March, the 25th of March, the conspirators managed to get access to a storeroom below the House of Lords. So I should explain that Parliament didn't look like anything like it did today. The building that we know as Westminster, yes, it incorporates very ancient parts such as Westminster Hall, but the building itself is built in the 1830s and onwards, the previous building having burnt down. Parliament at the time was essentially slap bang in the middle of a bustling town. People were living and trading in the parliamentary estate. Security, was tight in some areas, but nothing like today. And there were a lot of people trading. A lot of trade on the River Thames itself. A lot of people going by and all of this. So as we look at the traditional story of the purchasing and then transport of 36 barrels of gunpowder underneath the Lords, which is said to have occurred by the 20th of July in 1605, wouldn't have really have been noticed. It just looked like people were trading. It certainly wouldn't look out of the ordinary seeing boats with barrels going around the River Thames. So, as I said before, Parliament's meant to be open again on the 3rd of October. So, first things first, our riddle of remember the 5th of November should actually have been remember the 3rd of October. But due to a further outbreak of plague, Parliament's opening date is put back to the 5th of November. Around September 1605, you've got more people joining the conspiracy. Their word, not mine. Ambrose Rockwood, Everett Digby, they're joining. And then crucially, on the 14th of October, Robert Catesby invites his cousin Francis Tresham to join the conspiracy. Now, Francis Tresham is again an interesting character, but he's not entirely behind this plot so far. He provides funds, but he's very nervous. He's from the upper echelons of the aristocracy. So by mid-October, all of the conspirators, the 13, are all together. And I say 13, that's including Guy Fawkes. They're all together, ready to detonate Parliament. So again, if we just stick with a traditional story and looking at the impact of that, well, if the Parliament had been detonated in the way that we're told, then the impact would have been unbelievable. It would have been the equivalent of, the French Revolution in its entirety occurring in a split second. No king, no lords, the ruling class pretty much wiped out. And it's that I think we now need to delve into. It just sounds a little bit too good to be true.
So they were trying to take out everybody, really. So it wasn't just him. It seems to be focused on Parliament. I mean, of course, now the Queen Elizabeth II doesn't really spend much time in Parliament, does she? But I guess things were different then. They had a more active role, more likely to be in that building, and so you would get the King, you would get James the Sixth, along with with loads of with lords all together.
Well, whilst you have a House of Commons, commoners, who are predominantly Knights of the Shire at the time, the powers invested practically absolutely in the King. It's not like we have today, where you have political parties. You are basically under the complete instruction of the King. And the King needs a Parliament for taxes and for monetary reasons. So in order to raise taxes, the King has to turn up to Parliament, to the Lords, and essentially beg the Lords for whatever they can get. So that becomes interesting when you get to the Civil War, when Parliament refuses to back-to-back wars that Charles I wants to introduce.
And then you're getting into the English Civil War at that point, aren't you? Because there are repeated attempts to make parliaments more sovereign and just and to stop the absolute power of the monarchy. But in this context of Guy Fawkes, it's very much an attempt to get at the monarchy because Parliament is embedded completely with the monarchy. That is James VI, who was, as you say, although seemingly a Catholic and on their side, he was still continuing a lot of the repressions that were causing so much misery. So that then makes sense. So Guy Fawkes himself, you're saying, is this whole thing was real, but maybe embellished a lot more, to be a lot more than it was.
Well, yes. So I'm just going to, instead of skipping from 1603, let's just be specific on some of the dates, and then we'll move back on to some conveniences around the entire Gunpowder plot. So, 26th of October. So the details of the plot have been finalised. The idea of gunpowder directly below the House of Lords would detonate, wiping out all of the aristocracy. This is the opening of Parliament. So, like today, where you have all of the lords, all of the commoners assembled, including the monarch, the prime minister, etc. Nothing much has changed in that regard. Everyone was there, including the first minister or the first secretary of state, who was Robert Cecil, the spymaster, Elizabeth's spymaster, now James I spymaster. But again, we'll come back on to him. So you've got then. I've mentioned Francis Tresham. Well, there's this business of a tip-off. So, if we believe the story, or you believe the official account, what you have is on the 26th of October, Lord Monteagle, who's meant to be attending Parliament, but a sort of quiet Catholic, if you will, receives an anonymous letter telling him not to go to Parliament. Now, the interesting thing here is that letter isn't signed, but again, I'm going to come back onto this later. So, again, if we just follow the traditional timeline, Monteagle then takes the letter to Robert Cecil, who, as I say, Chief Spymaster, is the First Minister of State. Catesby's then tipped off, apparently, by Thomas Ward, who's one of Monteagle's servants, who then, through Christopher Wright, he then tells Robert Catesby, essentially the plot's been discovered, and tells him of the letter. This is the 28th of October. So why Catesby's still insistent the plot goes on, I'm not sure, but anyway. So Catesby's highly suspicious now that he's been stabbed in the back by one of his own, and that of Francis Tresham, who he believes has sent the letter. They decide that the plot isn't to be abandoned, but by the 1st of November, when James I strolls back into town, he's been absent from London hunting, he showed the letter that was sent to Monteagle, and then the 2nd of November, he orders that the Houses of Parliament and all rooms below and around be thoroughly searched. Nothing's discovered until, of course, the 4th of November, when interesting things happen. The Earl of Northumberland, who's rented the apartment underneath the House of Lords, he assures the conspirators that they've got absolutely nothing to worry about. The plot's not been discovered, even though there's been a search under Parliament. So then got a second search later on the 4th of November. Obviously, we now know the story. It's become more familiar. The gunpowder has been found along with lots of firewood beneath Parliament. People were told when they were searching that this room's owned by the Earl of Northumberland, Thomas Percy. It was his ward, sorry. So a second search is then ensued, and then all the gunpowder is found. And then from the 5th of November, bonfires are lit on the orders of James I to celebrate the uncovering of the plot. So I'm going to pause from the traditional timeline because the rest of it is, I think, in everyone's head. The burning, the hanging, the drawing, the quartering of Guy Fawkes, apparently. And there we go. Again, if this plot had actually happened, then you'd have had the Great Fire of London a lot earlier, as well as the wiping out of the entire ruling class of England at the time. So we need to just look at some coincidences first. The 5th of November is a few days after Halloween. And one of the things that people might not be aware, because we don't really think of Bonfire Night as Halloween, what we should do is just break down bonfire. So where does the word bonfire actually come from?
Interesting, yes. And you were saying also, just before you get to that, was that that London was actually that vulnerable in 1605 as it was in 1666, that if Parliament had gone on fire like that, it would have caused that Great Fire of London then. That's an interesting one.
Oh, absolutely. They'd been, London would have been destroyed. The pump.
Yeah, so just as we go, the call just got dropped there, calling a mobile to J. Martin, just as we were talking about that, so I'll just talk about that. What's interesting is, yes, maybe that, although it may be difficult to prove, it may have actually set fire to the whole of London, so it's now being alleged that maybe the gunpowder plot didn't happen in that way. Well, it didn't, as they said, but let's see if we can get Jay back.
Hello.
Hello, yes. Maybe the powers that be didn't want the true history of the country being passed across the communication. I don't know, as you're putting it. So, yeah, so you're now on to where does the word bonfire actually come from? Something that I hadn't really thought of. It's a strange word because the word fire, big fire, might have sufficed. I don't know.
Well, I've been doing this test for God knows how many years and telling the story behind it. But bonfire, it doesn't mean the French good fire. It quite literally means bone fire. And of course, at the end of the harvest, at the end of summer, back in the days before Christianity and sometime before that, the end of summer is seen as around about the 1st of November. Now, I should explain, there's no such thing as autumn, and there isn't really any such thing as spring. These are quite modern inventions. In fact, during the early days of the United States, they voted on whether to call the period we know as autumn or fall, to denote the falling of leaves. That's how modern we're looking at it. So the beliefs are there's summer, which is the time of growth, and then you have winter, you have the time of death. Now, the celebrations in terms of, we just need to have a quick look at the origins of Halloween, which for those who are from the Wicca pagan community will know it is the festival of Samhain. Now, a couple of interesting things about Halloween. Firstly, Halloween is people have been dressing up for thousands of years because it's believed that the thing that instigates death and instigates the onset of winter is that towards the 1st of November, the 31st of November, or I should say the full moon in October, November, which is what they celebrated, is this belief that the two worlds, the spiritual and the physical, join together, and that the demons of the other plane are allowed to roam the earth. So the idea is that you dress up, and how do the demons know that you're not another demon? So this is the notion of dressing up for Halloween.
So spirits will be close to the earth. Yes, that's the reason why. So it was a Celtic festival. When people say, "Oh, it's an American thing," well, that was inherited from this Celtic festival.
That's the Celtic.
Yeah. So and then of course we have the modern Halloween in consumer culture, in Western culture coming across from there as well. But it's come from that. So it's all a big circle, really.
Well, there's plenty of other traditions around the world which which involve people dressing up. In China, for example, there's celebrations dating thousands of years in which people dressed up again to ward off evil spirits. If you look at some of the masks there, they're meant to hide people from spirits. So this isn't an uncommon idea. But perhaps if we keep it in the so-called West, you've got other ideas of Celtic ideas of putting lanterns made of turnips, which gets that tradition through Irish migration, Scottish migration, ends up in the United States. Of course, there's no turnips there. They use pumpkins, so there's interesting theories about the so-called jack-o'-lanterns and all of that. But, and then you've got the idea of the bonfire, which is celebrating all of this around huge fires. Now, there might be a very practical reason for this as opposed to just a purely spiritual one. And that being that you burn bones, crush them down and refertilize the land. In other words, allowing the land to regain its nutrients after the growing season. Excuse me. So, firstly, we're looking at the bonfire. This has been with us for thousands of years. So, in the first of our myth busting, if you want to call it that, is that bonfire night certainly didn't start in 1605. So the idea of James I telling people to light bonfires is either through his own readings into the pagan beliefs, or more practically, it was an established tradition, of which there's plenty of notes on this. Now, some of the other bits of interest that follow with this is maybe an esoteric one, which is that of the Green Man. So the Green Man, who's often depicted in cultures, going back to Al-Qadir in the Sufi tradition, to the Green Men at Roslin. The Green Man is essentially that of nature and of knowledge. So it's interesting that there's an extract from a Sinclair, a John Sinclair, back in the 1730s, who begins to describe that of the Green Man and some other traditions involving parkin cake, which is often eaten as well. In other words, at the celebration of the end of summer, you have a cake to stay in you, and you've got parkin cake and all of that. But This thing I found interesting when I was reading this a few years ago was that of in the 17th century, the firework men of the day. Excuse me one second. The firework men of the day used to wear. These are people who would not only like fireworks but bonfires and any other kind of fire. Used to dress in foliage, garlands to protect the heads and faces from working with fireworks. You know, it still remains a dangerous profession even to today. So the greenmen, they traditionally used to, maintain order. You know, when bearing lit torches, they used to have batons stay out of the way. And there was then a phrase that's described by someone called John Bate, who's around in the early 17th century. He says that there's phrases such as, wild men who were ugly to behold. That was the description of the so-called fire men who were dressed in green foliage and all of that. This is quite famous in, when the coronation of Anne Boleyn, where you've got the fire club, the professional firelighters, who are then depicted in artwork in green. There's also depictions that of Isaac Newton, who then is alleged to be explaining to people how you create what would then become a Catherine wheel, something called a girandola, which I think has been banned in this country for God knows how long. But this idea of a movable wheel and the creation of these fire dragons and all of that. What I'm saying here is we're building quite an ancient tradition already. This isn't something that's just popped up really. This is the idea of a bonfire. A bonfire has been around for quite some time. And if anyone wants to read further about that, there's plenty of books on the Green Man, from the 60s. Kingsley Amis, who writes some fantasy about it. Dr. Tim Wallace Murphy has written about Rosslyn Chapel and the Green Man. And again, there's plenty of works dating all the way back to, all the way back to the 5th, 6th century BC, depicting all of this. It's not a new thing, is what I'm saying.
So it's really just changing the Guy over to supposedly being Guy Fawkes from what was in the Bone Fire, which sounds pretty grisly anyway. So I wonder if there's any historical evidence people started to do that almost straight away in 1605, or whether it developed gradually or not, or whether it was just attributed by the establishment to make it look like everybody was...
Well, no, I mean, again, I've mentioned esoteric, so... for those who've heard me before talk about the Sinclairs, I'll just give you Sir John Sinclair in his statistical account of Scotland, which dates back to 1793. He mentions that in the Highlands, bonfires used to be lit, and consecrated cakes would be baked on the 1st of November, in other words, first day of winter, and also then on the 1st of May, which would then be the first day of summer. We go further back than that. There's accounts from the 13th century of these bonfires. What was called the autumnal fire. I really apologise to any Welsh listeners, but this was called Coef, C-O-E-L space C-O-E-T-H. That autumnal fire, I'm just going to stick to that as opposed to offending the Welsh language. Was accompanied by ceremonies such as leaping through the fire, this sort of rebirth, throwing nuts into fire, biting into apples that were suspended by string. So you've got some origins of, bobbing for apples and all of that. People leaping across fires, saying, it's an old custom. Again, go back to 1793. Things like parkin and toffee on the 5th of November, relics of cakes that were offered as a symbol of sacrifice in Pagan's time. So these were known as soul cakes, a form of oat cake that was given to the poor in Lancashire, for example. And in Yorkshire, it's, you've got parkin cake, which is oatmeal and treacle and all of that. Which could very well be, the further development of one of these soul cakes. Halloween's still called, for example, Cake Night, perversely in Yorkshire. You've got the old customs that have been written about for hundreds of years of going souling, for example, or basically begging for these soul cakes, which believed to be the origins of trick or treating. In other words, you go and beg for one of these cakes, the parking cake or whatever. In other words, to cleanse the soul before All Saints' Day, or if we go further back, before pagan rituals, which I'm coming on to in a second. It's the origins of trick or treating. All of this, we shouldn't confuse matters. The 5th of November is a pagan ritual. The idea of the bonfire is pagan. That has had, a story attached to it, if you will. I mentioned the Green Man, of course. This is the belief that after the 1st of November, or that period of the full moon, everything begins to decay. But it's not seen as just, you could go around the world and look at this time of year and look at death rituals in all but name. Again, it's a cycle of the Green Man isn't seen as dying, but he's seen as he's born around this period, so that by the time you then get to the 1st of May, he's repopulated, he's back in alive and all very well, creating greenery everywhere. So again, it's just it's a simple pagan belief. So our idea of burning the guy, for example, well, that's interesting because the fires, as documented over time, have been firemen who used to it wasn't easy to create firemen used to dress in foliage. Again, as this idea of the Green Man, a pagan hangover. The bonfire itself is a pagan bonfire. It is a pagan hangover. The idea of jumping through, which could explain the origins of burning of the guy as a pagan hangover. We've got a pagan celebration here that's been going on in Ireland and Scotland for some time, that suddenly, after 1605, suits a political purpose, and that's of religion. And again, I just think it's useful for us to have a quick look at, we'll just do some myth busting firstly before I get onto my theory. So I'll just ask you, Michael, how did Guy Fawkes die?
Well, the official account says that he was undergoing the sort of the heavy police interrogation of the time, and that he ended up breaking his neck or something like that before getting the most grisly punishment of being hung, drawn, and quarter, or at least which is having all the insides ripped out and having to look at them as you pass out, which is
that's it. Most people will either assume that Guy Fawkes was burnt. Why else would you burn a guy? Burnt as a witch, maybe. Which, very curiously, is from a book called Malleus Maleficarum, which is about James I's idea of how to deal with witches and all of this. They get burnt on these pyres. Another very interesting idea, especially at this time of year where we think of witches and all of that. But he certainly wasn't burnt. He was sentenced on the 31st of January 1606, off the top of my head, to be hung, drawn, and quartered. A gruesome, grisly fate, which if you're a man, you would have your testicles ripped off. You'd be hung within an inch of death. Your testicles would be removed. Your stomach and your entrails would be burnt. That doesn't mean over a fire. It's usually with a poker. You're still very much alive at this point. Your arms are ripped off. Your legs are ripped off before eventually you're dismembered completely. Quite a grisly death. That didn't happen to Guy Fawkes, though. He ended up, he was on the gallows and ended up essentially ran up some of the ladders, or was it, was there a cart there? Who knows? And then apparently jumped to his death, breaking his neck. So already we've got this, the official accounts are already beginning to sort of break down. So he wasn't hung, drawn, and quartered. He committed suicide. This character of Guy Fawkes had great admiration from James I, for example. Apparently inviting him into the king's bedchamber. The privilege of all of that, I should just explain. Is one that lords, used to battle over. But no, it's all right. A traitor is brought straight into the king's bedchamber. Unusual to say the least. He describes apparently Fawkes as having a Roman resolution of which he respects. And then further to this, when he asks why, the famous quote of, I was trying to kick you Scots beggars back into, back to where you came. You've got all of that. Just strikes me as a bit odd, really, that you'd, be confronted with your murderer. What religion was Guy Fawkes?
Well, it should be a simple question, really, shouldn't it? And they were on the side of the Catholicism, Christianity, the branch there. But of course, in you asking that, you've got something else to say, I assume.
I certainly do. Well, according to the official accounts, the person that we know as Guy Fawkes, who historians say, it's this person, was actually brought up a Protestant. And whilst his grandparents were Catholics, well, all you need to do for someone who was born in 1578, most people's grandparents were Catholics, because by and large, the Church of England hadn't been established. Well, he was brought up in the Protestant faith, and it's only when his father dies that he's apparently brought up as a Catholic as a teenager. You've got you've got these little interesting sort of ideas that just begin to break down this character into. So you've got a Protestant, and then you've got his backstory. So he's in Spain, in the area that we know as the Netherlands and Belgium, fighting against, not necessarily just the English, but he's fighting for the Spanish, the Catholic powers. And he's described as a gunpowder expert. Now, I have just another question with this. I'm not sure what expertise he's got, and furthermore, any information that we have on him from this period comes from the spy network that was established by Robert Cecil. By gunpowder expert, do we mean he had the ability to reload and discharge weaponry? In which case, does that make you an expert? You've got this, this idea of the goodly Protestant, who then in his teens, turns to the other side, goes to fight for Spain before coming back under subterfuge, to join a plot in which, as we've mentioned, the plot is to put gunpowder underneath the Lords, 36 barrels of it, and watch as it blows up. There we have another question. What type of gunpowder was it? Was it the slow-release gunpowder that you find in cannon? Or was it the rapid explosive stuff that you would use in shot and in rifles, weaponry, and all of that? And the other problem is that of the barrels, that they've been left under there for some period in a damp. There's no draining. There's no drains or anything. Everything goes into the nearby River Thames and other rivers. The Fleet, for example. So you've got quite damp circumstances. Let's face it. If you go outside at this time of year, it's hardly sunbathing weather, is it? You've got damp. So even if we were to believe the entire story, the chances of the gunpowder igniting, in my view, is next to none. So you've then got this issue of Cecil. Now, Cecil's a spy master. If any of your listeners, want to look at how we ended up with MI5 and the surveillance state, well, he pretty much writes the book on it. He writes the book on torture. Torture was unusual at the time. It was believed by, all nations that you couldn't extract confessions under torture because they're most likely to be incorrect. People will do anything just to end the pain. So torture or confessions under torture are not seen as legitimate evidence in which to base a trial, because you would give misinformation. But again, he's sat there in the leaky, damp, I was going to say humid but foggy environs of the Houses of Parliament with this damp, wet gunpowder. He stayed after a previous inspection of the estate, so he waits, and then he's arrested under a second search ordered by. So the main conspirators, there's 13 of them, as I say, under Robert Catesby. You've got this figure of Guy Fawkes, who most people believe was the sort of ringleader. He wasn't. If this person and the story is to be believed, he sat in a damp storehouse, with a load of gunpowder, which I certainly don't believe would have detonated even if it had been lit. I think it had been too damp. But he's under torture. He's on the rack. So he then signs a confession, which most people have seen. He gets rid of his pseudonym of John Johnson, and this then becomes Guido Fawkes. Now, looking at his signature is very interesting, because a lot of people have said, this is a man under torture, but it could also be And I should say from previous work where, it was my job every now and again to look at signatures for when people submitted checks. It could very well be a signature of someone who was using their non-writing hand. If he was tortured as badly as we think, I'm not sure of his ability to even write a signature. Nonetheless, if the person existed and was under heavy torture, it could also be conceivable that the confession he makes is, it's a genuine letter. Now, the other conspirators have all retreated up to Staffordshire, to Robert Catesby's hall, ready for a standoff when they believe that the plot's been foiled. They're ready to have a standoff all the way up in Staffordshire, but they retreat, a few days beforehand, which again is just a little unusual. Why would you do that? Why would you retreat all this way, other than to meet your fate, maybe? So it's undoubted that the main conspirators undoubtedly existed. They were known to the state. They were known to Cecil as known conspirators. They'd been involved. Catesby had been involved in many acts of rebellion. And again, he owned property, which again is quite interesting. So you've got all of this, all of these sort of little aspects to the plot itself that just strike me as odd. You've, again, just to remind you, you've got a pagan tradition already in that of the bonfire. You've got this unpopular king, and then you've got this great plot to get rid of the king. So there's a few other bits to the patchwork before we begin to sort of draw up some conclusions. James I's daughter Elizabeth is sent away to school in a way that school terms haven't really changed too much, so she's sent quite late. So again, this strikes me as just slightly unusual. Conspirators' plan is to abduct her and put her on the throne after the plots succeeded. In other words, to sort of manipulate her in the Catholic faith. But it's odd that she's sort of moved away from all of this. You've got a letter that tips off a prominent lord that's not signed. So my problem with the letter is the fact that under the laws of the land at the time, firstly, it's not just that the letter's unsigned, but when all the conspirators were apprehended, if they'd written this letter, they might have saved themselves from torture and perhaps even death if they claimed to have written it. Because obviously, if you've written a tip-off, you're trying to stop the plot, aren't you? But again, that doesn't happen, and none of the conspirators, none of Catesby's lot, seem to know anything about the letter. And again, the letter is quite vague in content. It says nothing about the details of a planned attack, and yet the king and his men knew exactly where and when to catch the conspirators to stop the explosion just hours before it was meant to take place. So it strikes me as very convenient. And then you look at the history of Robert Cecil, and you begin to get a bit of a flavour for the guy. He's the ultimate spy master. He's turned England during, and his father, as he'd done beforehand, turned England into a surveillance state. There were spies absolutely everywhere. There were rewards for pointing out known Catholics and priests and anyone who's harbouring, any priest or anything like this. His tip-offs his main method of discovering plots. And let's not forget that it was his dad who essentially caused the death of Mary Queen of Scots by deliberately misleading her into thinking that there were, a plot was afoot to rid Elizabeth I. Actually, he entrapped, Mary Queen of Scots to sign off on a plot that was entirely of Cecil's making. So this sort of thing has happened before. So Cecil, who is wanting land, he's wanting to bring up Catesby's son as a Protestant after Catesby dies. He's wanting to seize assets from wherever. His family, his dad was a commoner. He didn't have any titles when he started under Elizabeth. Albeit he was skilled in Oxford, he had to earn his position as spymaster. These are newcomers to the aristocratic scene. So you then think, well, this is the perfect plot, isn't it? Not only can he get rid of and begin to round up known Catholics and conspirators, but he benefits himself personally from land from some of those conspirators. You've got an unpopular king who, is a foreigner, as I keep on saying. This is the attitude of this Scot who's come in. He doesn't quite understand England. He's unpopular. Things are very fractious. Again, let's put some context into this. Most people who were alive at the time had only known of the reign of one person, Elizabeth I. Now you've got this new line, this new family, the Stuarts. There's a time of uncertainty. So what do? You create a plot that is so horrendous in its idea that it unifies the country and begins to, it's so abhorrent even to Catholics that they quietly, fall in line. Afterwards, the king becomes quite popular after this, and there's a sort of celebration that exists to this day. But people don't really know what they're celebrating. It's pagan belief with a Catholic attached. So you've got all of these sort of quirks, and this figure of Guy Fawkes. His name might give it away. The sort of frightening, wretched thing. Guy, and this this idea of the Fawkes, the falconer. This ever all-seeing thing, whose provenance and background is very interesting. He's a Protestant, and it's basically for me, it sounds like if the person existed, certainly the way that we remember him isn't correct. It strikes me that the state that is heavily Protestant and wanted to solidify its command. This new dynasty manages to do so after the plot. There's a frequent reminder every year. It was a mandated holiday, not like today. I think in the middle of the 1858 rings a bell, but around about that period, it's a mandated holiday. You would have had the time off to go and celebrate this. Catholics are not allowed to hold office for some time. And it all seems to stem from this. And then you've got some other curiosities as well after the plot. some of the large halls that were known, Catholic bastions. So, for example, I'm just going to focus on one, which is that of Ordsall Hall in Salford. So, Harrison Ainsworth speaks in his novel in 1842, which is called Guy Fawkes, about a local story that the Gunpowder plot was actually planned by Robert Catesby in Ordsall Hall's Star Chamber, and that Guy Fawkes is supposed to have escaped capture during the siege of Ordsall Hall by the King's soldiers. He's alleged to have escaped by underground tunnel from Ordsall Hall to an inn near the cathedral in Manchester, the northern end of Deansgate. There's absolutely no evidence for it, other than the Radcliffes who owned Ordsall Hall were prominent Catholics. And this story is apparently based on rumour and hearsay. But that rumour and hearsay is so strong that the road at which Ordsall Hall's on is called Guy Fawkes Street. And there's plenty of stories from halls around the area that seem to, have that sort of tradition or that sort of rumour and all of this. And it just strikes me that the state is basically clamping down after 1605 for anyone who's harbouring Catholics, and that includes known Catholic families. And then you've got these sort of make-believe stories that Guy Fawkes was at this hall. Well, that's just a euphemism as far as I'm concerned for, this Catholic family, was under intense pressure to convert or whatever else.
So why would the state of today, the establishment of today, where, maybe we can't say that religion plays that much of a lesser role. It's still in the hallmarks of power, I suppose. But why would they be so interested in continuing this now, to even 2017, to repress Catholics?
Well, it was only 2 years ago that if you were Catholic, you couldn't inherit the throne. There is, I suppose, whilst I'm not of any religious denomination, there are still parts of the establishment that, are anti-Catholic. You've got the promotion of the Church of England. You've got, a national celebration. You might want to ask, why is it that in France do they celebrate, 14 Juillet? Which some people have argued, not an argument of mine, by the way, that you're celebrating the execution of, tens of thousands. Why do they still celebrate that? It's entered into the national psyche, but it never, my point is, it was never not in the national psyche. We've celebrated Bonfire Night for thousands of years. All we've done is we've made this a religious festival. And it's not as if the Church of England, wouldn't know or have learnt of this, because most Roman Catholic celebrations are actually built on pagan ones. Christmas Day, for example, hardly a time for the birth of someone, certainly not in a stable, following the star, that of Easter, Easter moves around with the moon. It's pagan fertility celebration. Beltane rings a bell. I've lost count the number of Catholic celebrations and festivals that are based on a pagan. Even the halos around people's heads in that faith, date back. I could talk for some time on this.
So why? So what do you want people to take from it then? Then really, just. This celebration's going to continue that way. So maybe it just takes on a modern context. Things evolve over time. What would you want people to change their minds over the way they view it, really?
Not at all. The reason for this is just to get people to think about when the state has a habit, especially today, of telling of taking maybe a veneer of truth and building it into a huge story, to essentially reinforce its own beliefs and its own power, effectively. Cecil is an interesting character. He wasn't exactly in favour with James I. James I, who had a lot of, how can I put this delicately? He had a lot of young men around him. Cecil didn't fit into that clique. But after the Gunpowder plot, he's, allowed to continue. He's significantly rewarded. The state becomes stable. Until the Civil War. You've got all of this idea of Protestantism. God's on our side, and all of that. Well,
that's quite a comprehensive history that we've had this afternoon from J. Martin over the history of Gunpowder plot. It does seem that Guy Fawkes was a real character. Let's just see if I can get him back on just to end it now.
In a nutshell, no one wants to take anything away from celebrations. Everyone, we look at the celebration of Bonfire Night in the way that, maybe 2,000, 3,000 years ago, other people did, that of a celebration. But I suppose it's just remembering what we're celebrating. And just looking at what the state says. If you look at Osama bin Laden, for example, the demonized character and all of this, and yet the states didn't argue, it was the United States, didn't argue for his arrest and put under trial. Instead, we're told a story of how he was killed.
Thrown into the sea, wasn't it? Yeah, supposedly.
Thrown into the sea. Apparently, Muslim tradition that I've missed. But there's another interesting aspect of this, just before we wrap up, and that's the idea of the. In 1606, Shakespeare writes one of his most famous plays, that of Macbeth. I should say it was probably written in 1606, but it undoubtedly pays homage to this story anyway. So you've got essentially which is the story of a king. It's about treason. It's about the downfall of murderers. And of course, King James was descended from Banquo, who was the Thane of Lochaber, who was the counterpart of Shakespeare's Banquo. And then you've got, well, where did this story all begin? Well, James the First's father, who was Lord Darnley, he was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, before she came to England. Well, he was quite literally killed on the 2 a.m., around about 2 a.m., I should say, on the 10th of February in 1567. So Mary was away, and 2 explosions had rocked the foundation of Kirkerfield, which is where he was staying. And these explosions were later attributed to 2 barrels of gunpowder placed in a small room under Darnley's sleeping quarters. So again, if we're to believe this whole plot and all of the rest of it, then it's odd how James the First and Sixth father was actually killed by gunpowder from underneath. And certainly, if you wanted to get the king's attention, that this plot is one. Plenty of coincidences, I'm sure, can be explained. Guy Fawkes, was he actually the was he the real person? This villainous leader of all of that? No, he wasn't. Was he a fall guy? Probably. Did he exist? Well, if he did, then it's certainly not as we know it. But hey, there's plenty of examples in history like this. Jesus being one of them. You could look perversely at the conspirators in, there is a biblical reference there. There's 12 disciples plus one. You've got the Judas of the group, who betrays them all. You've got the person who's, essentially tortured on a rack, and then, in all but name crucified, and all of this. Of course, that's just fantasy. But just for your listeners, look, enjoy this evening. Just think again. This is a celebration that predates 1605, and predates even the Romans. This has been celebrated for quite some time, and I would like people to just remember what they're meant to be celebrating. It's a bit like workers' history. We're told in history of kings and queens, and we seldom are told the history of workers. This is no different. Let's remember the people who were first here on these islands with their beliefs, that have carried on today. I wonder what they would make of trick and treating, treacle cakes, and setting people on fire. I wonder what they would have to say to us from down the centuries. I don't know, but I hope it's been an interesting Guy Fawkes talk, and yes.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for giving some of the deeper history behind the Gunpowder plot. That I think most of us just give a passing thought to whilst enjoying celebrations of things whizzing around and going bang and setting things on fire that you have a free reign of doing. And for what seems like a whole month before November the 5th and October the 31st anyway, at least for some of the celebrations that's going on for some people, obviously. Right, so thanks very much, J. Martin there on 107 Talk. 107 Talk was a Channel 107 production.